Hello, Planet Earth. Welcome to my YouTube channel, where at IDK, my BFF Jill 730.
My BFF Jill 730.
I'm Preston L. Young, wishing you warm salutations and congratulations as always. You've made your way to the Buffington Post.
You are invited!
Today we'll be taking a break from Buffy as it is time to review Season 1, Episode 2 of HBO's Westworld, titled Chestnut. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Here we go.
The time has come!
Making your way in the world today takes everything you've got. Taking a break from all your worries sure would help a lot. Wouldn't you like to get away? Sometimes you wanna go where everybody knows your name, and they're always glad you came. You wanna be where you can see our troubles are all the same. You wanna be where everybody knows your name. You wanna go where people know people are all the same. You wanna go where everybody knows your name.
This episode had me scratching my head. It threw me for a loop. I had to go back and watch it a second time because the first viewing, it was just like, what the fuck is going on here? All the characters are asking themselves the same thing pretty much, so I didn't feel too bad about it. But yeah, a lot of like, what the fuck going on? The second time I watched it, it was like, oh, everything just washed over me and I understood it so much better. But I will go ahead and warn you that a lot of what I'm going to be talking about in this video is kind of more about speculation on what's gone on in the past, what's going to be going on in the future, where this season is taking us, and what I feel like is kind of going on and has gone on within Westworld. So there's that. But I've decided to break this down into characters. I'm going to start off with our lead character, Dolores, whose quote of the episode was, "These violent delights have violent ends." Now, of course, this is what Abernathy, the father character, said to her in the last episode, which is kind of, we're suspecting that it's kind of waking up the androids in town, or at least giving them this kind of like virus, if you will. But the virus is there to wake them up, right? And so we have in this episode these conversations between Dolores and Bernard. One in particular where she's in the glass room that we saw in the promotional material for the show. But we have this conversation that's going on with Dolores and Bernard, and whatever is happening to Dolores, Bernard is clearly like in on it. He knows what's going on with her, and right now it appears that they are the only two within the structure of Westworld who understand what it is that's happening to Dolores. Now, Dolores herself may not completely understand, but Bernard seems to, and again, they appear to be the only two people who are kind of like in the know on what's happening. We have her like flashing back whenever she like hears this whole like remember of Bernard, right? And so she's waking up in the middle of the night, she's going out, like that's not supposed to happen, and she's having these like flashbacks of memories that she shouldn't have, right? And so she sees the whole town just like decimated, like there are bodies everywhere, and these are memories, and we'll talk about this more when we get into The Man in Black, but I'm wondering if these are memories from 30 years ago. We know that the Man in Black has been coming for 30 years, and he says in many ways that he was born here, and so I'm wondering if these flashbacks that she's having and that the Tandy Newton character of Maeve are having are 30 years ago, and I wonder if they have to do with the Man in Black's first visit. I'm really getting the idea that whatever the incident was that happened 30 years ago, because they said that they hadn't had an incident in 30 years, I'm thinking that the Man in Black was involved, and I'm thinking, well, I'll get into what I'm thinking more specifically, but I'm wondering if these memories that we're seeing of Dolores and Maeve's are actually from that 30 years ago incident, or if they are just, random memories from throughout their history. You could take it or leave it, like, pick your poison, like, whatever, but I do feel like it might tie into the incident that happened 30 years ago. Again, with the conversation between Dolores and Bernard, she asks him if he's done something wrong. She says, have you done something wrong? And I think that's a really interesting question to pose to not only Bernard, but to the audience, in that, what exactly is Bernard up to? It seems like he's very much, orchestrating this, whereas in the first episode I thought it was Anthony Hopkins' character Ford, and I don't think that he's blameless in this at all, don't get me wrong, but it seems that he's not solely responsible for what's going on, and that Bernard is maybe his right-hand man in introducing this kind of what we consider to be intelligence into these people. And of course, at the end of the episode, after we see Dolores wake up a couple of times, we see her wake up and she goes out and there's a gun buried outside of her, farm. And so I'm wondering, I'm pretty sure it's a real gun, right? That's the only way that it's dramatic, because we get guns everywhere. And so it appears to be a real gun that doesn't only kill AI, but will actually give her an upper hand against humans. And so that's all very interesting, Dolores. And what was really interesting about this episode is that in the pilot, it's very much presented to us that Dolores is kind of our protagonist, whereas this episode felt much more like an ensemble show. Now, moving on to the smoke monster, I couldn't help myself. Lost and Bad Robot produces this, how could I resist? But the Man in Black, smoke monster, blah blah blah, whose quote of the episode is, "Every detail amounts to something," which is really fascinating for this episode. There's so much to Westworld, there's so much that we just don't understand about it, and this character who's been coming to this place for 30 years is still unraveling the mysteries, and he doesn't know everything about it, but he does seem to have a very intimate knowledge of this place, which is really fascinating. And so in this episode, we see that he goes and gets this character called Lawrence, and clearly they have been acquainted before, but of course because of the android's kind of reboot system, Lawrence doesn't remember him. However, it's clear that the Man in Black has come upon this man before, and this hanging that he comes upon seems to be something that happens every day, okay? And I want to say Kissy is the character's name that got all scalped in the last episode. He was presumably the one who kind of led him to Lawrence, the Man in Black, that is. And so I'm wondering if, even though they get rebooted all the time, and maybe their storylines are changed and they're kind of plugged into different stories, I'm wondering if those kind of base relationships between characters in this world do maintain. It would seem that they do, and it would also seem that it would kind of be impossible if they were put into different roles. But that really kind of remains to be seen, but it appears to me that the relationships between these android characters do maintain, kind of despite what roles are kind of plugged into, and it's all very confusing still. And anyway, he wants to use Lawrence to, again, try and get to the deepest level, as he called it. He's trying to get to the deepest level of this game, and he goes into this kind of little Mexico town, and it's almost off the grid. It's there. It's a place within Westworld, but as one of the human characters who's a guest says, there's so much to it, you might not ever get to the end, because, there's so much out there. And it kind of goes into how is this cost effective for them to have this functioning town out there, but it's pretty irrelevant. The point is we get to bring this Lawrence character home, and we see that the emotions that they're kind of programmed with do affect the way that things happen, although not really. It seems that the emotional element isn't as important as the actual getting to the bottom of things, because only after they kill everybody else, including Lawrence's wife, that the little girl kind of comes to. She's like, it's not meant for you. And the thing about it is, it not being meant for the Man in Black is a very interesting thing to take into consideration, because, again, I do get the idea that there is some kind of mysticism about whatever it is that the Man in Black is trying to find. I could be totally wrong, but I do think it has something more metaphysical in nature than just some grand Easter egg, right? So the idea that it's not meant for him may have to do with, kind of the blackness of his soul. And is he an evil character? Sure, he comes in and he does all of these evil things, but the more we're looking at him, it seems like he's after something very, very real and not so kind of superfluous or superficial. It's fascinating me. And anyway, she said something about following the Red River to where the snake lays his eggs. And I'll come back to this when we talk more about Anthony Hopkins' character of Ford. But moving on to Maeve, whose quote of the night is, "In this world, you can be whoever the fuck you want to be." Which is so hello, that's exactly what's going on here, isn't it, Maeve? So in my last video about Westworld, I talked about how they say this saying to them, and they're like, oh, blah, 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 a deep and dreamless slumber. And I questioned the notion that they were having a dreamless slumber. And so we have Maeve in this episode, and she's talking about dreams and how she had a dream, and she has dreams, and she's talking to this other character about how to wake up from a bad dream. And that's very much what's going on in this episode, isn't it, Maeve? We're talking about dreaming and remembering, and we have Maeve, after Dolores kind of says this phrase to her, suddenly kind of clicking out, something's not right with her. She's dreaming, she's remembering things. And again, I'm wondering if these memories that she's having are specifically from this incident 30 years ago. Again, it may not be, but I can't ignore that time frame that they've given us, this 30 years thing, right? It's hard to ignore. Either way, she's waking up, or malfunctioning, as would be the case for the human characters involved. And once she starts malfunctioning, they do these little tweaks to her. They kind of up her aggression at first, and that doesn't work at all. And then they up her perception too, okay? And when they up her perception after everything kind of goes down with her waking up, and then that was fucked up, right? Thandie Newton really sold it. I've always been a pretty big fan of Thandie Newton. I love in How to Lose Friends and Alienate People, she played herself, and it was very funny. And so I'm a fan of Thandie, and she does a great job of making the horror of being in the complex, which we find out is completely underground, by the way. All of the Westworld human-y parts are totally underground, which But she also does a great job of selling the horror of not knowing who you are and not being able to really understand what it is that you're going through. And so I found all of that to be quite lovely. But we have them, they up her aggression, doesn't work, and then when they up her perception, I think that's another key in kind of waking her up. After they kind of do something to her, one of the characters says, well, I want to fuck her, so what's the deal? And they talk about the guests wanting to fuck her, right? But after they kind of fix her with the new perception and getting the thing out of her abdomen, we'll get to that, rather than go for the John herself, she passes him off to the younger girl, right? And so it's now that she's fixed, she's not going to just fuck these people. And not just fixed, but awake. Now that she's kind of self-aware, it's I'm not going to be a victim. I'm not just going to fuck these people. I'm going to do the job and make it look like everything's hunky-dory, but I'm going to pass him on to somebody else. Because it goes back to what I was saying in the last episode. What if you just woke up one day and realized you were a slave? Sure, you can still play the game, but you're not going to play it by their rules anymore. And so I thought that her kind of handing the dude off to another woman was an interesting, very, very small character development for her, because she's not going to just fuck this guy because it's, in her programming. We also learned from Maeve that Teddy may not quite be the great guy that he appears to us as. She says that her girls don't kill people, basically. And so I don't know if he's killed somebody in the past, or if he's a hitman, or I don't know what his deal is, but we're definitely going to get to learn some more stuff about the James Marsden character of Teddy. And another thing that I'm wondering is, okay, so she hears this phrase, and then she starts to get these pains in her stomach, right? She's got these memories going on. but she gets this pain in her abdomen. And they find out, like the scientists find out that there's been something lodged in her abdomen. But my question is, how long has it been in there? It would seem that she didn't recognize it until the whole violent delights and violent ends phrase came into her. And so I think it's a byproduct of these memories. And I'm wondering, how long has that thing been in her abdomen? Has it been in there since the incident from 30 years ago? That's something to keep in mind. Now let's move on to Bernard. Bernard, I have some very interesting thoughts on, and a quote that wasn't from him, but a quote that was said to him is from the French lady who says, "Is that what you're doing now? Practicing?" And once I get more into this discussion, I think you'll understand why I chose that as his quote. But Bernard Lowe is his name, and I'm just like, what the actual fuck are you doing, Bernard? Because, again, he's having these conversations with Dolores, and he's, talking to this person, and he is making her, erase their conversations that they're having, and he's trying to keep it very hush-hush, and it's like, what are you doing? Like, what's the point of this? But we do also have him having a real, actual human interaction and relationship with the French boss lady, right? And the French boss lady also says something about, something being ready for launch, because she's been talking to corporate. And so whatever corporate is and whatever they're getting ready to launch, I don't fucking know. This whole episode, I was like, what the fuck is going on here? But I will say that I like the idea that we have him talking to robots, we have him talking to humans, and he and Ford are definitely in on something together. And now we're going to go and talk about Ford so I can give you my complete thoughts on Bernard. Ford's quote of the night is, "Only boring people get bored." And I really like this character. He talks about what they do as being witchcraft. They speak the right words and they create life. Just so interesting, and I like the connection between language and magic and life. They're all kind of intertwined, aren't they? We get this really weird moment where we have him talking to what's pretty, obviously an android child version of himself. He's talking to this kid who clearly appears to be himself because, they talk about how their fathers say the same things to them, and that's beside the point. And he asks the boy if he can hear a town with a white church. There's a bell ringing, and they hear it together. And so that white church, we're going to get to that. But I think the really interesting thing about what's going on with the Ford character in this episode is we have the British guy, and he's trying to launch this new attraction for Westworld, and it's this very gory scene of Odyssey on the Red River, right? And so Ford turns it down because he says it doesn't say anything about who the guests really are, and that's the whole point of this place as far as he's concerned. He wants to bring out the real nature of the people who come in. They want to find out who they are, and the idea of the park is to give them these avenues and these different experiences to kind of bring out their true selves as Will's maybe brother-in-law is kind of forcing down his throat, be who you really are. And the big question that I got from this episode is, I'm wondering if Bernard is one of Ford's creations. I talked about it in my last video on the show, but I'm wondering if maybe the ultimate goal here is to transfer human consciousness into an android body. And maybe Bernard is human consciousness in a robot body, because we did see a picture of a little boy that Bernard was holding in the first episode, and I'm wondering if maybe that's actually him. I'm wondering if maybe he had some kind of debilitating disease, or if maybe he was some kind of human victim in whatever the incident from 30 years ago was. Something or other, and Ford has been creating android bodies for him to live in. I know it's a bit of a stretch, but I'm wondering if, because of the line that the French lady says to him about, "Is that what you're doing now? Practicing?" When, he talks about how the androids talk too much because they're practicing with one another on how to be people, right? and she asks him if that's what he's doing. And so I'm wondering if Bernard introducing this kind of intelligence into the androids is because he doesn't want to be the only one. Like, what if he is kind of the one giving them the fruit? Like, he doesn't want to be the only enlightened one. Maybe that's why he starts with Dolores. Maybe he and Dolores have some kind of kinship beyond what we understand already, like maybe in the past, right? So that's very interesting. And we have Ford and Bernard, and they seem to really understand each other. They seem to really be on the same page with one another, which makes me think that maybe, yes, he is one of Ford's creations, but I don't know how much faith to put in that idea yet. But talking of faith, when he and Bernard go out together and they look at the kind of steeple almost situation, it definitely has a cross on top. Ford says he has an idea for something new, and I'm wondering if he wants to build that town with a white church as a new attraction, and I'm also wondering if that church has been here before. But moving on to Will, who doesn't have a quote, but more has an action, just his tip of the hat to Dolores. I really like that. It was like, oh, no words, just good, kind actions. And so he comes in with this guy who I'm assuming is not only his business partner, but also maybe his brother-in-law, because he says something about his own sister having, ridden some cowboys when she came to Westworld. And also Will himself says that he has somebody waiting for him back home. And I am getting the impression that maybe these guys are brothers-in-law, but I don't know. But either way, this may be a brother-in-law, definitely like a business colleague. He says to him, what makes you think this isn't work? And so I'm wondering if maybe they have some kind of darker purpose in being in Westworld, or maybe not darker, but an ulterior motive to, coming and playing this game. Maybe they are maybe they work for the competition, maybe they're actually corporate, I don't know, but we'll see what's really going on and their purpose for coming into Westworld as the season progresses. But what we have in this episode is we have Ford talking about we need to find out who the guests really are, or the guests are here to find out who they really are. And his partner in crime, or whatever, he says that, he brought him to Westworld because he wants to see who he really is, like see the real him. And that raises so many questions, because from everything we've seen, like most of these people, they just want to come and participate in this debauchery and just go ham and, fuck everybody and kill people. And so it would seem that the idea of Westworld is you come in and you find out that your human nature is to be an awful fucking person. But human nature isn't necessarily that. And they seem to make a big deal about Will choosing a white hat. And hopefully his white hatness will in fact, persevere throughout the season. But the thing about a white hat is it's very hard to keep clean, practically. And so think about that. All right, so let's talk about this church. Anthony Hopkins wants to create a new attraction, and it appears that he wants to build this town with a white church because, he's like, don't you see it? Don't you hear it? And so what that says to me is, like when you bring in a religious element to the situation, it brings in the question of belief and of faith. And we can already see that some of these robots are waking up. This is what this episode is about. Like, Tandy Newton is trying to wake herself up. Like, they're all trying to wake themselves up. And so the thing about religion is that it does offer a sense of freedom. Religion and freedom and the freedom of belief are all very much tied in together. That's why any kind of religious persecution throughout history is taken so seriously, because it is a slight against your personal freedom. We associate religion with freedom, and some people find freedom from religion. And so I find it really interesting to kind of introduce the idea of a church within this world, because I don't believe we've actually seen one in Sweetwater, like in the main little town. And so if you introduce a church into this, and you can not only create artificial intelligence, but give that artificial intelligence faith, that fascinates me. I think that is the most intriguing idea that they could really go into, because belief and faith and religious institution is such a big idea in the human world, and to introduce that into the android world, I think would be fucking fascinating. And going back to what I was saying earlier about the Lawrence's daughter character, you can look at this phrase of, you know, violent delights and violent ends as being kind of this like fruit of enlightenment, but church and any kind of religious institution serves to provide enlightenment. And so when you think about that, maybe her saying to where the snake lays his eggs, maybe that's exactly what this grander Easter egg situation really is. Maybe the snake is Anthony Hopkins in the situation, and that him laying his eggs is this place where the church will be, question mark. And I'm also thinking that this church idea was there before. We saw in the promotional material for the season, we see Dolores walking into a church, and I'm thinking that those are memories, and that whatever this incident was that happened 30 years ago, it may have happened in this church. Like maybe the church was scrapped, which is why it appears that the steeple is like buried in the ground. Like maybe there's a church under there. And the idea being that if you could go to Westworld as a guest and you decided to go to church, again, it goes back to what Anthony Hopkins is saying. It says something about who you really are, doesn't it? If you go on vacation and you decide to go to church with a bunch of robots, it probably says something about your faith. And if you were to go in and shoot up a bunch of people in the church, then you might have a situation where that idea of faith and belief and freedom are being completely challenged and kind of undermined and disrespected. And if that's the case, then what if you went and tried to shoot up a church, like you'd have some pretty bad consequences. And maybe that's where all of this began, and maybe that's why there isn't a church as yet. And so like it was more articulate when I thought of it. But as far as the mystical element of what might be going on here, if there is indeed any kind of mysticism going on, we had to read this book in my humanities and human rights class in college called Massacre in Mexico. And it details like the events of the massacre in Mexico when a bunch of young protesters were shot and killed around the Olympics that were going on in Mexico City. A lot of young people were killed and there was a lot of blood shed, and it happened to be on the same spot that the ancients used to sacrifice young people to their gods at. And so there's this idea that we get in Lost, and I'm saying this because Lost is very much about specific geographical places having special qualities and such. And so maybe this Westworld place is something similar. Like maybe it requires some kind of like blood sacrifice or some kind of outpouring of emotion in a certain space in time, or just a certain space geographically. Hopefully that makes sense. I know I'm like wrapping my tinfoil hat around me right now, but I really think there is something to be said about that. And hey, even if it's not true, it's just one of the many theories that I've got about this show that's keeping me very intrigued and tuning in Sundays. And I'm also wondering / hoping that we'll get an entire episode that gives us a flashback to whatever that incident 30 years ago was. But really, that's pretty much all I've got to say about this episode, you guys. I hope you're having a great 2016 so far, everybody. Let me know what you thought of this episode in the comment section down below. You can come right back here to the Buffington Post anytime for Buffy the Vampire Slayer reviews, Angel and Faith reviews, Buffyverse discussions on the other Slayers, and more. I am going to be continuing my Season 9 wrap-up videos very soon, so stay tuned for that as well. Have a great day today, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
A dream is a wish your heart makes when you're fast asleep. In dreams you will lose your heartache. your dreams, and someday your rainbow will come smiling through. No matter how your heart is grieving, if you keep on believing, the dream that you wish will come true.
Think of it as a game. A fun, funny game. Without all the rules, or any of the bothersome winning part. But still, there are sides. You have to choose a side.
D.
My BFF.
Joe?
730.